President, please be seated. The court is now in session. This morning we will continue to hear the testimony of the expert David Chandler, who will be questioned by the defense teams, initially by Nuntia's defense, before the other two defense teams. Before the floor is handed to Nuntia's defense team, Ms. Chakraborty could report the participation of the parties and the individuals to the proceeding. Chakraborty. Good morning, Mr. President. All parties are present except the accused Ieng Sary, who is present in the holding cell downstairs. He waives his right through his defense counsel not to directly participate in the proceeding for the entire day today. The letter of waiver has been submitted to the greffier. Thank you. President, thank you. The Chamber has received the letter of waiver by Ieng Sary dated 23rd of July through his counsel to waive his right to directly participate in the proceeding and instead to follow it through a remote means. And that is for the entire day proceeding due to his poor health that he cannot sit for long to follow the proceeding. And Dr. Lim Sibutta, who is a treating doctor of the accused at the detention center of the ECCC, also recommends that the accused Ieng Sary has a dizziness symptom and fatigue, and that he should be allowed to follow the proceeding through a remote means in the holding cell downstairs. The Chamber is of the view that the accused Ieng Sary, due to his health, who expressly waives his direct participation and instead to follow it through a remote means in the holding cell downstairs, and that he is in a position to directly communicate with his defense team. His request is therefore granted. And that he is authorized to follow the proceeding in the holding cell downstairs through audio-visual means for the entire day proceeding. The AV unit are instructed to link the proceeding to the room downstairs so that Mr. Ieng Sary can follow the proceeding through the entire day. The floor is now given to Nuntia's defense to put question to this expert witness. You may proceed. Counsel. Good morning, Mr. President. Good morning, Your Honors. Good morning, Mr. David Chandler. I have some questions for you, and the first question is the following. Mr. Chandler, in your capacity as a researcher and an author, what is the percentage of your belief during the course of your research upon your interviews with the people and upon researching the documents at their original locations? What is the percentage of your belief in that regard?
Thank you. I'm not quite sure what the question means. If you mean I've drawn my conclusions, what percent of my conclusions have I drawn from interviews and how many from documents? Is that what the question means? In which case I can say probably it varies from book to book. I mean, I did very few interviews for the S-21 book for obvious reasons. I did a lot of interviews for the tragedy book, quite a few for Pol Pot. Documentary evidence in all of these books was heavy, so I'd say, maybe 75-25 for the history, for the tragedy book. This is documents versus interviews. 80-20 for Brother Number One, documents, interviews, and 95-5 documents, interviews for Voices from S-21.
Question: during the course of writing the books, that is, all the books that you have published, of course you did conduct your research, but you did not all the time go through the original locations in the book. Either you were told or you learned of the locations through various documents, and then you compiled all those facts or all those information in your books. In my first question that I put to you is that whether you do trust and believed the information that you received from those various documents.
Well, this is exactly the point that a historian has to make choices between the documents he believes because they're heavily corroborated, the documents he distrusts for various reasons and often casts aside, and the same is true with interviews. It's an intuitive thing largely, whether you're relying on what the interviewer is saying or not. These are all different choices, and surely going to the locations of the sentence of the things that I wrote, I mean, with the time factor, it was impossible for me to go, for instance, to Paris in the 1950s. I couldn't go to the killing fields in DK because I wasn't allowed into Cambodia. So exact locations, I did go as much as I could after 1990 to Cambodia to do my interviews. So I'm not sure that the location where the documents were generated or the original location of the people I interviewed in different places was a factor in what I wrote.
Thank you. My second question is the following. On the 18th of July 2012, in your reply to Madame Judge, quote, at that time the Democratic Cambodia was not recognized by the world. What did you mean by that?
Well, I'd have to revisit to see what at that time was, but certainly Democratic Cambodia did not accept diplomatic recognition from other countries, except for, I think, China, North Korea, Vietnam, Laos. There were other embassies that were open for a while in Cuba and other places that closed down. Recognized, I meant diplomatically recognized, and it would depend on what time you're talking about. If you mean April 75 or whatever it was, and it fought. The point I think I was trying to make there underneath what I said was that the regime of Democratic Cambodia didn't pay much attention to diplomatic recognition from other countries and certainly didn't seek it from countries that it was not closely related to.
Thank you. During the period of the Democratic Cambodia regime, that is from 1975 through 1979, as shown by various documents, it is said that Democratic Cambodia had some diplomatic ties with embassies, in particular with those communist countries. And there were various representatives from the Eastern Communist Bloc. As I recall, there are about 30 communist parties who joined the communist countries who joined the communist parties, and majority of the Eastern Communist Bloc had a diplomatic tie with Democratic Cambodia. And the question is, as there were a number of diplomatic embassies, in particular those communist countries, who recognized Democratic Cambodia, who had commercial trade with the regime, and at the United Nations, the flag of the Democratic Cambodia was also recognized and flown. So the question to you is that in your response to Judge Cartwright on the 18th of July 2012, what was your interpretation of that?
Thank you.
Witness, please hold on. We need to hear the objection by the prosecution first. You may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. Reluctant to intervene, but we object to the form of questions, particularly the last question and an earlier question as well. It is not appropriate for counsel to preface his questions by a series of statement or assertions of fact. If counsel wishes to put specific facts to the witness, he can do so by referring to documents and specifically quoting from them. But it's not appropriate for counsel to give facts from his own recollection.
Defense counsel, let me respond to the objection by the prosecution. What I have put into question to Mr. Chandler is based on his response to Judge Cartwright's question on the 18th of July. President, the objection by the prosecution is sustained. Your question is vague and relying on the response of the expert to Judge Cartwright, who put many questions to the expert on the 18th of July 2012. You need to clearly quote the exact term or the exact reference to that particular statement, the line number, for instance, or the page number and the year number of that transcript, so that it can be viewed by the parties and the chamber. Mr. Expert, you do not need to respond to that question raised by the defense team. Thank you, Mr. President. I'll move on to another question. My next question to Professor Chandler is the following. Did you ever see the administrative structure and the role of the Democratic Cambodia, that is official administrative structure and role? Have you ever witnessed or seen that?
បានទទួលច្បាស់លាស់ទេរចនាសម្ព័ន្ធតាំងពី
That is, I mean the administrative structure from the upper through the lower level.
You're referring to the structure of the government, am I right? How, any documents that would suggest or define the structure of the DK government, is that what I'm being asked? What your question, I'm afraid, wasn't entirely clear to me. Or were you referring to the embassies again? I'm not sure. I couldn't quite get what you're asking.
The President, Council, you need to be clear whether you talking about the document or you referring to the structure without the document. Your question is very difficult to understand. If you refer to the organizational structure or the administrative structure of Democratic Cambodia, that is the practical structure, that is a separate matter from the official structure. Thank you, Mr. President, says the Council. In the Democratic Cambodia structure, that we have relied upon in various documents and that we have discussed for many months. For instance, the structure of the party, the structure of the government, as well as the structure of the National Assembly. What I want to refer to is the structure of the party. Have you ever seen the official structure of the party?
I've seen documents that help me to reconstruct what this structure must have been, and a lot of this is contained, of course, in the statutes of the party that we looked at the other day. The structure of the party running down from the secretary of the Central Committee on down through zones and offices and what looked like ministries but weren't called that has all been heavily documented, and it's available for study, yes.
Questioned. What about the governmental structure of the Communist Party of Cambodia? Have you ever conducted research into that area or ever witnessed any official document?
I think, thank you. I think my testimony the last few days shows that I am familiar with this structure through my familiarity with a whole range of documents. The freshest that I've seen in the last few days, of course, is the Communist Party statutes, but there's the Constitution. There are several organizational charts that are readily available. So it is a subject I've studied, and I wasn't directly appropriate to the things I was writing, but it was useful, and I needed to study it before I wrote what I wrote.
Thank you, Mr. Chandler. The title of your documents as recognized by the Chamber, that is document E3/17, entitled Pol Pot Brother Number 1. My question in regards to that book is, why do you use or decide to use the title Pol Pot Brother Number 1 as a title of your book? Is it because based on the structure that it is recognized that Pol Pot is brother number 1 and then there are brother number 2, number 3, so on and so forth? Do they really use numerical structure in their structure at the time?
This is one of the, thank you. This is one of the many names by which Pol Pot was known. They didn't use this in official documents. It's a if you like, an intimate and respectful designation. For him, he's sometimes called Uncle Secretary or Homme l'État, but I think Brother Number One he was never called anything lower than Number One. He was, of course, the Secretary of the Central Committee. This was a term in use during Democratic Kampuchea, and I thought it would make a suitable title for my book.
Question. You have already clarified the structure of the party, that is, it's in a pyramid form from the upper to the lower level. What about the subordinate units at the lower level, for instance, office as 21? To your knowledge, do you think that the lower level would have the same organizational structure as the upper level?
Sometimes yes and sometimes no. In the case of S21, it was again a collective leadership, but with the ruling vote, if you like, on certain decisions taken by Deutsch, who was the leader of S21. He was the only one authorized to communicate with higher echelons, and primarily only with Son Sen. So, yeah, it was somewhat pyramidal, but in the zones you have political, economic, and administrative groups of three running the situation. So, yeah, but it's not quite as precisely pyramidal form as the Communist Party in theory. Sometimes things broke down, sometimes more people were stronger or weaker than they were supposed to be in the organization chart.
Thank you. Mr. Chandler, you have conducted your research for several years and for quite a long time. And some of your books that you published based on your research the question to you is that during the course of your research, had you ever seen the signature or the stamp used by the higher level or by the central level? Have you ever seen a document signed and sealed by those official people?
I don't think I have. I've certainly seen documents that we were discussing the other day that are in Son Sen's handwriting, so I guess he's one of the higher people, moving a document forward to Brother Van, who's Yung Siri, or Brother Nguyen, who's Nguyen Chia. Their own signatures, the signatures of, people have been working for years to try and find the signatures of Pol Pot on documents. I don't think it's ever been found. That people have guessed maybe that's his handwriting, maybe that, but no firm view. But certainly Son Sen's handwriting is known quite well. That he was roughly number 3 in the organization.
Question: if you have never seen the signature of the upper level or the middle level for the orders to the lower levels, is it your conclusion that generally the orders that were alleged that were issued by the upper echelon for the killing of their own people. Is it your conclusion?
The question is not clear to me. There certainly are documents in Son Sen's handwriting back to Duik telling him to, suggesting that he continue to work hard to take or smash individual people in S-21. There's oral evidence from witness statements and so on that I haven't consulted in detail, but I've seen them in interviews that other people have conducted, suggesting that orders came down to gather in or to smash certain characters. Certainly, these orders came down. I think they were not signed, but they were obeyed. So it seems to me that they were obeyed and that they were known to be coming from above is the proof that I wanted. It's all the proof I needed. That's a weak answer.
Questioned Mr. Chandler, on page 104 of your book Voice at S21, you state that the senior cadres selected some of the biographies of their subordinates for review. Nuon Chea expressed his regret that he did not pay much attention to this matter, and that is, he stated that he is lacking in this matter, that he did not follow the biographies closely in regards to the core members of the party and to make measures to sweep clean within the party, and that he only looked at the general characteristics of those people, and that he did not look into details of their background biographies, and that is the enemies to infiltrate in the party. What do you mean when you write that statement in your book? Can you enlighten the chamber? That is, in regards to Nuon Chea's speech.
I'd need to see the quotation in full. This is a statement that Nuon Chea made. It's certainly exculpatory, so I'm not entirely sure how much we have to rely on it, but I'd need to see the page in front of me to answer your question more accurately. Could we maybe get it on the screen? Could we get the page on the screen, maybe, so I can see the full quote?
The President, Counsel, you appear to have quoted from the text written by the author, by the witness. So could you also project the ER numbers in 3 languages of the quote to parties in the court proceeding, and if available in hard copy, you should also proceed with the document to the expert for examination before he could respond to your question. Council. Thank you, Mr. President. I am very sorry that I have not prepared all the necessary documents to put questions to the witness, and I believe that the expert could still remember his writing. That's why I did so. I may skip that question, by the way. I have another question. Based on several documents, mainly the telegrams from the military, from the zones. In those documents, people who would be addressed would be brothers like Brother Noon, Brother Wan, Brother Ham. In each of the documents that addressed to each individual, there should be a copy, for example, copy to other people in the subordinate section. According to your research, do you believe that people who have been copied had the level of authority as those intended recipients? For example, if it was addressed to Brother one and then CC or to other people, whether these people also exercised some power as the intended recipient. I don't know whether my question is clear, but it is more about the administrative structure and thing.
Well, that's a very interesting question. Certainly, just as in normal bureaucratic procedure, people who are copied on a document do not have authority to act on it. They have authority to read it and to share it with the person to whom it's been addressed. Now, I kept stressing in my earlier testimony that the DK was a collective leadership, and that these people felt themselves entitled to make collective decisions and to be aware of things that were happening. The fact that the addressed names of many of these telegrams, several of which came to my attention after I finished my research, my written research, are of a very limited number of people who are familiar to us, and some of them are here today, shows how small this pool of informants was, and I can re-emphasize from that the tight security in which the regime operated and the secrecy with which it carried on most of its activities.
Council, thank you very much, Mr. Chandler. This is going to be my last question. The decision made by the Central Committee on other matters. This document can be referred to document E3/12, dated on the 30th of March 1976. First, the document concerns the right to smash within and outside the ranks. And the objective is, first, there shall be a framework to implement our task and also to enforce our authority. One, at the base level, the decision shall be made from the center. Surrounding the central office, the committee of the office of the center shall make such a decision. And point number 3, in the independent zone, the standing committee shall be the one who made the decision. And fourth point is about the central military. So with regard to this decision, I have a question to you like this. Now, the authority had already been laid down to each respective unit. What was the authority of the supreme leaders? Because the decision was already made and supposed to be handed down to people at the base or at the respective unit, did they still carry some authority or had the authority to know about what happened at the base? For example, the shortcoming of medicine and daily affair, whether it really the decision then made by the central committee or each respective unit instead.
That's quite a complicated question. The document itself does not speak of any difficulties or hardships happening down below. This is where there's none of the standing committee documents that have survived, as I recall, mention hardships or difficulties at the lower echelons. But certainly this document, which was never passed on literally to the lower echelons, but gave some of the people in the standing committee a guideline for what orders would go down, orders which have disappeared, probably went by telegram, we don't know. But I'm sure there was a tight relationship between the center and the bases at this time, center and the zones. This is before, in March 76, is before these zone and sector leaders came under suspicion. It was a period when the central government trusted these people and these people trusted the central government. So I'd say this is quite an authoritative document that would have been followed up with other more specific orders that have not survived.
Council, Mr. President, I have no further questions to put to the witness. However, my colleagues would like to also put some questions. Before that, Mr. Nguyen Chia have a question to put to the expert through the President, if you allow him to do so. The President, Mr. Nguyen Chia, you may now proceed. Nguyen Chia. Good morning, my fellow Cambodian citizens. Good morning, the court and Mr. President. Good morning, Mr. Expert. I have two questions indeed. First question is, from the very beginning until now, the conflicts between Cambodian people and the People Party of Cambodia and Vietnam, what has been the cause of these disputes? Has it been resulted from the border dispute or from other matters? That's first question. The President, you could hold on your first question and wait until you hear a response from the expert before you proceed to the next question. Mr. Expert, if you get the question, you may respond should you wish.
Thank you. And with respect to Mr. Nguyen Chia, who is a person whom I do respect, this is a crucial historical question that would probably take 100 pages to answer. The conflicts between Vietnam and Cambodia, between the CPK and the Vietnamese Communist Party, between the preceding and subsequent, the preceding regimes, and so on. It takes us, to give a proper answer, would take us way outside the parameters of this court because of the 1975-79 limits that have been set. But certainly the causes that I have tried to come up with, there's nobody wouldn't, of course, know the primary cause. This is all a matter, we've had these discussions in previous days, it's a matter of informed opinion. But it seems to me that there's a good deal of blame, if that's what you're looking for, or responsibility that can be shared by the two parties, springing from, I think, I think, a failure to respect the opinion of the other party, an animosity that goes too deep to allow for negotiations. And so it's not a question of who started what, but it's a question of an animosity that was already exhibited by the Lon Nol regime, continued under the DK regime, an animosity of, if you like, the Vietnamese fought the Lon Nol regime. The Vietnamese and DK were in conflict from more or less open conflict, although it was secret to the world, in late 77 and then opened up in 78. Causes of this, I think, if you want to just, I don't mean to say you want to, that's not respectful, but if one is looking for a phrase to describe the causes, I would say it's a lot of history and mutual distrust.
The President, Nguyen Chie, you may proceed with your second question. Nguyen Chie. What was the cause of the birth of the Communist Party of Cambodia? Was it born by the People's Movement or by outsiders? The President, Mr. Chandler, you may proceed to respond to the question, if you may.
Well, the way it was translated to me was it's a question of what was the cause of the birth of the CPK. Well, I think we've seen in the discussions before it is widely published that the CPK as a name for the Cambodian Communist Movement dates only from 1967. But if instead of by birth one means precedence, you have to take the history of the party back, as many authors have done, into the late 40s and early 1950s, when the Cambodian Communist Movement was, let's put it this way, the ideals of the Cambodian Communist Movement were shared with the Communist Party of Vietnam, which was then called the Socialist Party, I think, that the idea was to remove the French colonial power France from its colonial power in Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. So there was a shared objectives. There was a certain amount of Vietnamese training of the Cambodian Party. So you can say that to some extent, the origins of what later became known as the CPK in 1967, if you take them back into the late 40s and early 50s, have a close relationship with Vietnam. When you get closer to 1967, when you get to the 1960 Congress, for example, which of course their minutes and decisions have never been fully explained, it seems to me that Vietnamese influence has diminished quite sharply, and by the time the CPK is preparing statutes and so on during the Civil War, that influence has faded. So there's a whole history of a relationship with an outside power and a whole history of an autonomous movement, first going along with Vietnamese cooperation and then gradually removing itself from that relationship.
Mr. Nguyen, Mr. President, I thank you very much indeed. I have no further question. The President, thank you. Now we hand over to International Co-Counsel for Mr. Nguyen.
Thank you, Mr. President, and good morning to everyone, and especially good morning to you, Professor Chandler. Thank you for being here with us again after what I'm sure was a tiring week last week. Today I want to start to ask you some questions about the sources of your knowledge. And we spoke about that, or you spoke about that already last week, so I will be quite brief. But I would like to come back to a statement that you made on Wednesday. It is in the transcript on pages 52 and 53, and I will just quote it. You stated the following, and I quote, "Just a personal footnote. When I was writing those books in the late 1980s, I would certainly have been much happier had I had access to the materials in the closing order. Because I've been reading material in the last couple of days that would have been just perfect to put into my books. But this material was not available to me." Professor Chandler, could you tell the Court what material exactly you were referring to when you said that you'd been reading material that had not been available to you earlier?
For example, I refer to the open letter by Norodom Sihanouk. It's called Mon histoire, les derniers jours du régime Democratic Cambodia, describing, is an open document, but it's footnoted in the closing order, describing aspects of the conversation he had in early January 1979 with Pol Pot that had not been available. Things like this, documents that statements, for example, that were given by some of the people, by some of the other direct statements. Nothing in those statements would have altered my general findings. They would have amplified and added to the footnotes in my book. I didn't find any revelatory material that would have changed it, but the piling up of material that I found in the closing and many other documents that were given to me, like some of the confessions and so forth, just amplified my knowledge, which has been, shall we say, a bit. I haven't been hard at work on the Khmer Rouge for some time. It lit up some places in the history that interested me. I think my remark in Wednesday may have seemed a bit jocular, and I didn't mean that as saying, for instance, that anything I'd read in the closing order would have made me recant or take back anything I said in the others, but that I felt the material that had come available since 1998, which is when I stopped writing, would have improved the books I wrote before that. Or some of the material, not all of it, of course.
Thank you, Professor Chandler. And the follow-up question to this is, when you were reading the closing order, did you get to read all the footnotes that are attached to the closing order?
There's over 6,000 of them. The answer is no. But I looked up when the subject interested me. I looked in the back and found out what I could cite. That's why, for instance, why I cited that Sihanouk letter. Many of the things that were interesting had witnesses' names blanked out and so forth. They'd be unusable for me in anything I wrote. But I often checked something that interested me in the back, and there'd be something redacted and this kind of language, perfectly fair. So I cited one sort of semi-open document. There are also statements made by Khieu Samphan to the court, which are court documents, were cited that way. They clarified some of his biographical details, little details that I had not been aware of. So when I found something interesting and found that it was an open document, I made a note of that. Otherwise, I'm afraid I didn't say such and such. It's untrackable. It was just some of these footnotes you can't, the way they're rendered in the document, you can't. There's no way you can use them in a historical work.
And I'm asking you for the obvious, but that is sometimes our task. Did you have access to the documents that came out of the investigation by the OCIJ that were labeled confidential?
I don't think I did. I don't recall that.
In your testimony last week, you also spoke of 3 big books, which you refer to as primary documents, and I was wondering which 3 big books you were referring to.
These were books that I had hard copies made of the documents that people said they would be talking to me about when I came to the court. The biggest book was a book of the confessions that had annotations with it. The third book would have been the closing order. And there's a fourth one that I can't quite identify, but it certainly would have been possibly the translations of the confessions. I think that's it. Because I looked mainly at the Khmer one to look at the those transmittal things. There were texts of confessions of several pages I didn't consult because I heard here that we can't use that as evidence, so I skipped those pages.
And as a follow-up question to that, have you been reading any documents in preparation for this testimony that have not been provided by the parties to this trial?
Yes, I've been reading some published books that have been written about the trial. They've been written, to refresh my memory, the book by John Kikari about the tribunal is one I've read. I've looked at, let me think what else. I just think open sources, no confidential documents of any kind. Nothing that's not available to the court and might even be a court document. But yes, I've refreshed my memory with some of the books and articles about the court to see, because I had not been paying attention to it for several months.
That leads me into the next question, which you partly answered, but have you been following the proceedings of the trial, this trial case 002? And if so, to what extent?
Primarily by newspaper accounts, but also occasionally from emails from people who have been participating in the inquiries. But mainly, I would say journalistic reports, because I haven't been gathering material myself to write a book, write an article about the courts. I haven't been assiduous in gathering sources. It's been an informal process.
And considering your interest in Duik, which is well known to all parties here in the court, did you pay attention to Duik's testimony in case 002?
I'm not sure I had access to that. I certainly paid attention to him in case 1. I'm not sure I'm sure because of his vivid use of language, I'm sure I would have remembered reading that testimony. I don't think I did.
Do you remember? Excuse me. Do you remember reading newspaper articles about Duik's testimony in case 002?
No, I don't.
Have you been in touch with any of the other scholars on the DK era in connection with your testimony here at the court, and that can be contact either by email or by telephone or maybe in person?
Yeah, I mean, of course I have, and I've not received any suggestions that these contacts should be restricted. I've been in touch with many friends and colleagues, particularly as I was coming to the court, to just refresh myself on the way the court's been operating and what testimony's been given. I've missed the Duke testimony, as you suggest, but yes, I have been in touch with friends and colleagues.
Professor Chandler, to be absolutely clear, I'm not placing any blame on you for having contacts with these people. Not at all. I'm just trying to establish what your sources of knowledge are, what your sources of information are, and on what information you base your testimony here today. So that's all I'm trying to establish, and I do not hold you at fault at all. Having said that, part of your primary research into the DK regime has consisted of studying the S-21 confessions. And you stated last week that you are convinced that the S-21 confessions were culled after the fall of the DK regime. Could you explain to the courts what exactly you mean with the expression to cull?
I'm relying there on the testimony of, I don't think he has not testified to the court, but a person, an intellectual who was in 1979 one of the first people to be asked to work through the archives of Tuol Sleng. This is a man called Ong Tong Hung who lives in Belgium. He wrote a book called I Believed in the Khmer Rouge. He described in that book how Vietnamese officials at that time were reading a lot of these confessions. And I know that's true because many confessions have Vietnamese writing on them even now, comments that I can't read. It's certain to me that other documents have several people we know were at S-21, important people. The confessions are not there. For instance, the key one example of something I suspect very strongly was culled was the confession of Ne Saran, or Ya, the secretary of the Northeastern Zone. There's 40 pages in the archive, mostly consisting of instructions coming from Deutsch and so on. Whereas one of the interviews that Stephen Heder conducted in 1980, which very, very fresh, very close after the regime and long before these published research was around to, change people's minds. One of the people he interviewed, former Khmer Rouge, or maybe even active Khmer Rouge at that time, but in Thailand, said that there had been a speech by a high party official quoting from this confession that took an hour. So something happened to that hour-long confession, and again, why one thinks it might have been culled is it's also the only confession that Pol Pot mentioned in his interview with Nate Thayer. Oh yes, there's Ya. Remember that confession. I mean, he probably knew a lot more, but that's all he said. This was a very important character, and the Northeast was an area, or of course, bordering Vietnam, and it seems to me, again, with no evidence, sorry, that this was a confession that actually contained information about his relationship with Vietnam, which is a logical and sensible thing for some of the Khmer Rouge to have, in the sense that they felt things were spinning out of control. Where do we go? Who's more sensible? Go to our friends. This person had been fighting with the Vietnamese alongside them for years. So it was not in the interest of the Vietnamese in the 80s to have that confession there, because it would say, at least one of the confessions in Tuol Sleng has information that suggests that we were ever subverting this regime. Now that's a lot, I know there's a lot of suppositions there, but we also know, and that there are collections of documents that are known to be in Vietnam that were taken from here, not available to anybody. We don't know that they include confessions, but I suspect they might. They certainly include party documents. So I mean, that's a long answer, but that's the source of my use of the word cult.
Thank you. That was a long answer, but very insightful, I think. My initial question, I think, was meant to be a bit more simple, and I simply wanted you to explain the word cult to the people here present in the courtroom, because I'm not sure that it translates very well into Khmer and or French.
Well, it means for an outside party to go through a series of documents that they have generated and select either things that interest them particularly to make a smaller pile of documents, or to remove documents that are not in their, that they feel would be not in their interest. And I think maybe both processes would work in this case. Certainly for the party documents that we know are now in Hanoi but completely inaccessible, this would be of interest to the Vietnamese and of thought by them, of course, not to be useful for the wider public.
And when you were speaking about this topic last week, you also mentioned the PRK in connection with the culling. Could you expand on that a little bit? Because you now spoke about the Vietnamese.
Well, the Tuol Sleng Museum of Genocide was set up by the Vietnamese, and there were Cambodians working there in the archive and so on. I'm not sure if I suggested that there was systematic culling of the confessions by officials in the PRK government. That's not right. I mean, that's not fair. But it occurred under PRK, and this early days, I think the officials of PRK were not in a position to resist what they were asked to do by their Vietnamese associates. Later on, if this process of, I was thinking the second batch of confessions that is mentioned that went to DC Cam coming from Interior, the ones that were from Son Sen's former office, it would seem to me, not for the PRK, but for the Vietnamese, this would be a very nice bunch of documents to take away because they're very revelatory. But certainly the Khmer, the PRK did nothing to keep these documents out of circulation.
Also in connection with this, you stated that the Vietnamese were very historically minded, and I think you partly answered my question already this morning, but just now. But could you explain how the Vietnamese were very historically minded when it comes to culling the confessions?
I think there was genuine historical curiosity at work here. I mean, Vietnam has a long tradition of history writing, history reading. Books of history are bestsellers in Vietnam, which they're not necessarily in Cambodia. The notations of confessions in S21, texts in S21, suggest that some of the people assigned to this archive were genuinely interested in finding out what had happened. They didn't understand the Khmer Revolution. This is well known. It didn't seem to operate in a way that a communist revolution was, in quotations, supposed to operate. so they were reading to try and discover what happened. And they kept documents because they keep extensive archives. They've got and these archives are largely inaccessible to outsiders, but it seems to me if you were people without historical turn of mind, and this I think is a way you can characterize many Cambodians not having such a turn of mind. You don't have to, you don't want to. They would have destroyed these archives. I remember, this is an anecdote, but it fits, back in the UNTAC period when they were setting up the National Assembly and so on and so on, they suggested that they should have a Hansard situation where all the debates of the National Assembly should be recorded and printed and bound, and this went nowhere. They weren't interested in that history of the national. This was not bad. They said, no, what's the point? But so it's a historical cast of mind, is what I'm saying, basically.
Thank you. I understand your answer. In connection with this topic, I would like to show you an excerpt from your own book, Voices from S21. It's document number D108/39/2, and English ERN is 00192667232. My ERN is 00191816289, and the French ERN is 003572472. 451. And the page I want to talk about is page 9, and with your permission, President, could this be shown on the screen?
The President, yes, you may proceed. System, then copies of the receipts with the projection of the document on the screen.
And we have a hard copy available for you in English, Professor Chandler, but I'm also going to read it out. So it is whatever you prefer. Would you like to have a hard copy in front of you, or would you like me to read it out to you?
Court officer, could you deliver the hard copy document from the council for the experts to view?
I will read the relevant excerpts to you so that also the wider public can hear it. And I quote from your work: Cambodians' interpretations of the Pol Pot era slip easily into Manichaean frameworks that make poor history but are emotionally satisfying and consistent with much of what they remember. This point has been driven home by the French psychiatrists Hegel and Landrak, who worked in Khmer Rouge refugee camps in Thailand in the 1980s. It is always more comfortable to have a Manichaean vision of the world, for that allows us not to ask too many questions, or at least to have the answer readily at hand. In this fashion, representing the Khmer Rouge as a homogeneous group of indoctrinated fanatics, the incarnation of absolute evil, responsible for all the unhappiness of the Khmer people, is a reductive vision of a complex phenomenon, but one which a good many people find satisfying. And here, Professor Chandler, I get to the quote that I want to ask you about. Within just such a Manichaean framework, the PRK regime worked hard to focus the genocidal clique that had governed Cambodia between April 1979. As relevant for us now, but while the new government based its legitimacy on the fact that it had come to power by toppling Khmer Rouge, it was in no position to condemn the entire movement, since so many prominent PRK big figures had been Khmer Rouge themselves until they defected to Vietnam in 1977 and 1978. Professor Chandler, what I want to ask you about is this quote within the quote. Within just such a Manichaean framework, the PRK regime worked hard to focus people's anger onto the genocidal clique that had governed Cambodia between April 1975 and January 1979. Can you explain to us in what way the PRK regime worked hard on this enterprise?
Thank you. Yeah. Certainly in the trial of Ieng Sary and Pol Pot for genocide that took place, I think, in August 1979, also in the textbooks of Cambodian schools in the early 1980s, through such things as the annual Day of Hate on May 20th, I think, every year, the institution of the Museum of Genocidal Crimes. Again, I'm not ever suggesting that the leadership of DK was as collective as we know it was, but was in fact the sort of plaything of a corrupt and insane pair of people, Pol Pot, Ieng Sary. I use those things in quotation. I'm certainly not referring to Mr. This is what they were trying to do. Reduce it to personalities. And just as an aside and in parentheses, it's the way we think ourselves. So I'm not talking down to these people. We talk of Reagan's America, or as if he was entirely responsible for everything that was happening. We talk of people in Cambodia talk of the Pol Pot era, when there was a lot of other things happening besides him. But it's a way we concentrate ourselves often on a person. We'd rather do that than talk about institutions that we don't understand. But yes, they made an effort to have this history limited to a handful of people, and also to be written in such a way that it was absolutely evil and abhorrent to, in such a way that it would be absolutely evil and abhorrent to any sensible Cambodian citizen.
And in connection with this, you have written elsewhere about a dominant narrative of the Khmer Rouge era, with, as you say today, just a few demonic perpetrators and millions of innocent victims. Do you think that narrative that was created during the PRK years is still relevant for our perception of the DK period today?
Not if we're trying hard to understand what happened. It isn't much help in trying to understand what happened. I get the feeling, the admirable feeling that this is one of the missions of the court, both prosecution and defense and witnesses, whatever, to try and come to grips with what went on. And I think you can say without hesitation that what went on was not the behavior of two genocidal people totally in charge of the country at all times. So this kind of history, I don't think it's relevant at all to what we're doing. I think it's out there, and that's, I think, perhaps maybe contrary to the good work of the court.
And if we go back to your early research of the DK era documents, are you confident that the PRK or Vietnamese officials did not destroy or tamper with these documents in their possession in such a way to emphasize the criminality of this handful of absent demonic perpetrators?
Well, my only answer there is if they did, they didn't do a very good job, because the documents have all been thousands and thousands of pages have come into evidence at the trial, at this tribunal.
Then I apologize, I may not have formulated my question clearly enough. But what I'm trying to ask you is whether you think that the Vietnamese have manipulated the evidence in such a way by taking away documents and DK-era documents that might reflect a less important role for the leaders at the top.
We've no evidence that that's what they did, but I mean, we've heard evidence earlier in the last week that these standing committee meetings took minimally on the basis of once a week, and often more frequently. We have 15 of them, or we have about 9, I think, of them, the 15 documents. So that mass of documents, it either was destroyed or it went somewhere, and we don't know which. I don't think there's evidence that it survived en masse. And I think people will recall the statement that Duch made, if not in his trial, at least in his interviews, that Mr. Nguyen Chia in the 80s came across Duch, who wasn't an acquaintance, but just distant. And he said, "Why didn't you burn your documents? We burned our documents." So that's part of the answer, that some of them were, destroyed. I've got no evidence, however, that the PRK or the Vietnamese did anything to documentary form to enhance this. Because as I said, once you go through the documents, this myth doesn't stand up. So it didn't work. If they tried it, it didn't work. I've no evidence that they did.
Thank you. And in connection with this, we have spoken about the 1979 trial of Ieng Sary and Pol Pot. Based on your research, what do you know about the selection of evidence for that particular trial?
Well, that's an excellent question. Some of the witness statements at that trial are extremely valuable today, because there were, I know, for instance, the witness statement of the woman whose name is Denise Afonso. I interviewed her twice in Paris. Her memories coincide exactly with what she said at that court, and they were a harsh indictment of the kind of experiences she'd had. The evidence was channeled so that it would produce a picture of some of the horrors of the DK period. Many of the witnesses were very well chosen to speak of these horrors, and spoke of them accurately. There was why the trial has not attracted any respect, or much respect, overseas over the years, is because it was certainly a kangaroo court, and this will make your job maybe more difficult. The defense lawyer assigned to Pol Pot and Ieng Sary jumped up and said, "These people are insane monsters and should be destroyed." This is a defense lawyer. So this was not, all those aspects of the trial were absurd. But at the same time, they wanted to show the world, or they hoped to show the world, what a terrible thing had happened, and a terrible thing had happened. And these were authentic witnesses who came forward. I think a lot of them have come forward again in this tribunal to suggest, or several of them, suggest what had happened to them. The value is, this is 1979, a year away from the collapse of the regime. These memories had not had the time to be tampered with, or altered, or blurred. So there's many valuable things in the trial, and I've drawn from them sometimes, but the format of the trial was very strange.
Okay, thank you for that answer. And I would like to speak with you about moving away from your sources of knowledge for now. But I would like to speak to you about the American bombardments of Cambodia I'll not give too much information, but let me first ask you an open question. Could you give us a brief introduction of maybe 2 minutes about the American bombardments of Cambodia as they occurred in the 1970s and perhaps the 1960s.
Yes, I'd be happy to do so with the court's permission, because this seems to be the 60s, 70s, sometimes in, sometimes not in our purview. If this question is allowed, I'd be happy to answer it, but I don't want to get led back into questions about the 60s and 70s without knowing that this is an area that we can talk about freely and at length. I'm not trying to avoid the question. It's a good question. I want to answer it, but only if I'm allowed to do so.
Well, the question is meant to understand the context in which the DK regime
The President, Mr. Expert, you can respond to the question put to you by the International Council for Nunjia, and please make it brief. And because you are an expert and also a historian, so you also respond. You may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm happy to answer that question. As an American citizen at the time, I now have dual citizenship, and as a scholar of Cambodia in the 1970s, I was appalled by the American bombardment, where a massive number of bombs were dropped on a country with which America was not at war. And I've written that this was one of the, to my mind, one of the darker moments in American behavior overseas. And I should mention in that context that I am a loyal American citizen. I am not going to throw away my passport. I was ashamed of that conduct. Other things just as bad or worse have happened since, but this is writing in the context of 73. Now, the effects of the bombing on the Khmer Rouge movement, this has been widely debated. The sources are quite contradictory, whether the bombing encouraged people to join the Khmer Rouge or encouraged people to flee to Phnom Penh. I think it did both to some extent. I think at one of his interviews in the 80s, this is not verified, I mean, I don't have the document in front of me, but Q Samban said it didn't make any difference. We moved away. We were always, our troops were in good shape. We didn't get damaged. The troops didn't get damaged by this bombardment. He was saying this is the Khmer Rouge forces were skillful enough to not to be decimated by the bombing. We don't know the amount of casualties the bombing inflicted on the Khmer Rouge military. We do know that their capacity to take Phnom Penh was postponed by 2 years. And this, taking a very cold, amoral foreign policy view, was the objective of the bombardment, was to keep a communist regime from coming to power to the west of Vietnam, which was still, west of South Vietnam, which was still a non-communist state allied to the United States. So there are tactical explanations for it that don't wash with me. I don't have no Well, my preceding comments, this is I think a shameful moment in American history. I think very well described in many public sources. Well, I'm sorry, not just American history, but a shameful event for Cambodia is also, by all means. Americans didn't suffer at all.
Thank you. That's a very clear answer. And you mentioned the year 1973, and that's also a year I've seen in your writings. I don't want to steer you in any way, but was 1973 the only year of the American bombardments, or the only year that American bombardments took place?
Oh, not at all. I didn't mean to suggest that. 73 was, however, the year of the most intense bombardments on areas that did not have apparently clear military significance. It was also the year in which these bombings were stopped as immoral by the U.S. Congress. Bombing the border areas with Vietnam officially began in 1968-69. There have been stray planes crossing across the border a little bit before that, but as a serious campaign of bombing began particularly in 73, when the ceasefire had been signed by the Vietnamese and the Americans, and the Khmer Rouge had refused to sign. Cambodia was, as one cynical general said, the only war in town. This was a place that the Americans felt those ceasefire didn't apply, so therefore they could unleash resources onto the country that they could no longer unleash on Vietnam. It was a long history of American bombardment, but I think 73 is the year when most of the bombs were dropped, when there was the least, when it had the least connection with the Vietnam War, and the most connection was simply a war undeclared and I think unjustified between the United States and Cambodia.
And you have stated, Professor Chandler, that you have, if I may paraphrase, stopped writing books about this era in 1998. Since 1998, have you studied or encountered new material relating to these bombings that informed you in any way?
Yeah, yes, indeed. Thank you. There's some material published. It's quite a strange publication in a Canadian journal called The Walrus by my former student Ben Kiernan, and he's one of his students at Yale. And when that material came out, it was quite shocking. It amplified the number of bombs that had been dropped, the amount of destruction that took place. But when I read it, I wondered why this article had not been sent to a refereed academic journal where someone could have been verified. It was printed as journalism. And it could well be that those figures and the conclusions are completely valid. I'm not saying they're not. I was quite, as a scholar, I said this is not the way these figures should reach the public, through a unverified journal of, well, it turns out the journal has a kind of anti-American slant. That's okay, but I mean it should come through a refereed journal. For some reason, I don't know, I'm not in touch with either of those people, they chose not to do it this way. And that's why I don't ever cite that document when I talk about the bombardment. If all its charges are true, and it's possible they are, many, many more thousands of tons of bombs were dropped in 73 than we realized, than previously announced.
And
the time is now appropriate for a break. So break for 20 minutes and we return at 10 to 11. Court officer, could you assist the expert during the break and have him return at 10 to 11?
សូមអញ្ជើញក្រុមជំនុំ